time we talked about the rise of Mussolini and Hitler, the beginnings of fascism in Italy, Germany. Today we're going to talk about Joseph Stalin, the person who kills maybe more of his own citizens than anyone else in the 20th century, outstripping Hitler's murderous extent by 3 to 4 times at the very least. Stalin was, as you can see, a dashing, handsome young man. Stalin was not his original name. He was from Georgia, but he tried to pass himself off as authentically Russian. We've talked about the distinction between, and by the way, Georgia, I mean in the Caucasus. I don't mean Atlanta. But, tough crowd. That was meant to be a joke. And there aren't many jokes when we get to this topic. So let's return to the kind of dilemma that was facing Lenin in 1921. He had implemented a socialist program, admittedly in very difficult circumstances with the Russian Revolution and the results of World War I. But the result of that initially was disaster, starvation, industry collapsing, and so on. And so he instituted in 1921 the new economic program, which was meant to allow peasants to actually grow their own food, to be able to exchange it to some limited extent on the marketplace, to allow, in short, market forces to come back into play to some extent in Russia in order to give people incentives to work, in order to give them incentives to grow the food in the first place, to comply with government orders to turn it in, giving them an incentive to work in the factories and so forth. Well, Stalin took over as soon as Lenin, shortly after implementing that program, or really conceiving of it and barely having the ability to implement it, had a stroke and was incapacitated. He died in 1924. And so for a couple of years, he was already incapable of fulfilling his duties. Stalin was the person who took over, so even before he became officially the head of the Communist Party in Russia, he was already pulling the strings behind the scenes. Paul Johnson refers to Stalin's reign as moral relativism in a monstrous incarnation. And what he has in mind is this. Trotsky, one of the intellectual leaders of the Russian Revolution, said that problems of revolutionary morality are fused with the problems of revolutionary strategy and tactics. What does he really mean? In the end, this is a reductive claim. It is not simply that strategy and ethics have to be brought together and one has to inform the other, but rather, in the end, problems of morality are nothing but problems of strategy and tactics. That is to say, what is right is what serves the purposes of the revolution. What is wrong is what stands against the purposes of the revolution. And there is no independent moral constraint, in other words, other than the revolution itself. So what that became under Lenin and Trotsky was a way of saying Marxist ideology, our particular version of Marxist ideology, becomes the sole source of any value. Under Stalin, as we'll see, it becomes really Stalin's personal edict. He tried to liberate things even from any kind of ideology, as we'll see, so that his will became supreme. Well, Stalin had already taken power, and we see many photographs that were put out during this era of Stalin and Lenin together, trying to give the impression that Lenin thought of Stalin as his true heir. He posed as a moderate initially. He looked like the person who was sort of in the middle of those who might have been competitors for leadership after the death of Lenin. Here you see him again, photograph of Lenin. Here again. But he wasn't the only person who might have been a plausible candidate. There were many people who were involved in the Communist Party, who were part of the Central Committee in 1917. And if you look at the details here, you can see what happened to them. We have Dray-Khmara, shot. Bukharin, shot. Sverdlov died of typhoid. Stalin himself lived until 1953 when he had a cerebral hemorrhage. But Zinoviev, shot. Josef, suicide. Smilga, shot. Let's see, Kamenev, shot. Trotsky, assassinated. Gulag died in prison. Lobov, shot. Here we get some additional ones. Yes, Berzin, strangled. Bulyutin, shot. A train crash, claimed Artem. Krasinski, shot. Sokolnikov died in prison, and so on. And so most of those people ended up being killed by Stalin. It's quite a striking story. there were a lot of people, several dozen, who were in the leadership of the Communist Party after the Russian Revolution. Stalin managed to get rid of them one by one, usually pushing them out of power first, then pushing them out of the party, and then eventually having them executed. Here were his main competitors: Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin. And as we've just seen, they didn't come to very happy ends. Now, the way in which he played all of this was really quite remarkable. There are a lot of photographs of these people together. By 1924, Trotsky was already out. He was murdered with an ice pick in 1940 in Mexico. The others ended up being imprisoned and shot. And the way in which Stalin did this, the metaphor I like to use for it is the movie Mean Girls. Okay? It's as if these were the plastics, okay? And what do? I mean, what happens in that movie? How does our hero set the others against one another? Yeah, there's a lot of gossip, a lot of behind the scenes. You know what she said about you, and so forth. That's the way Stalin did this. He turned people off against one another. He was the one who, of course, was everybody's friend. Oh, but listen, you know what Rykov said about you, Trotsky? Oh, and you know what Trotsky said about you, Zinoviev, etc., etc. And he did this very skillfully in such a way that he increased the suspicion all of these people had toward one another. So at no point did anybody say, wait a minute, we've got to stop that Stalin, he's out to get all of us. No, it was rather Stalin saying, listen, we got to get rid of this guy, don't we? Oh yeah, look what he's saying about you. And so he got the others to acquiesce as that person was imprisoned, as this person was exiled, as that person was murdered, and so forth. And it was all done really quite brilliantly through this series of political maneuvers, sometimes more overtly political, but often really Mean Girls type stuff. On Wednesdays we wear red. Well, anyway. The others, as you can see, were out shortly thereafter. So within 4 years, Stalin had managed to take all of his main competitors and push them out of the party leadership, push them out of the way so he really had no competition. Now, during this time, there was a certain amount of violence used, but for the most part, Stalin was doing this through political intrigue, through gossip, through political maneuvering. So most of this was done without a great deal of violence. But as we'll see, that didn't last very long. He set up, as soon as he became the sole head of the committee, the cult of personality that then became famous and led to the erection of all sorts of statues of Stalin all throughout the communist world. He was described as the man of steel, the granite Bolshevik, the universal genius. And indeed, he convinced everyone in every discipline their main goal, their main objective should be to express Stalinism, to express his ideas. So here, for example, we have an economist saying, our task is not to study economics, but to change it. We are bound by no laws. Now, in part, the inspiration behind that quote is the final one of Marx's theses on Feuerball. The philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. But here, as you apply that to every particular science and say the point isn't to study economics or study physics or study meteorology or study whatever, but instead to change it, you all of a sudden have a reason to proceed in developing science, developing social sciences, humanities, etc., whatever you do, in a way that's completely independent of the facts and completely independent of the actual laws that might govern economic behavior or physical laws or biological organisms, etc. Now, Stalin did have a kind of ideology. He wrote a book called The Short Course in Marxism. And it's, at least at first glance, hard to see how much it has to do with Marxism at all. But here's the basic idea. He starts with a philosophical claim, a claim of materialism. The world is purely material. There are no minds independent of matter. Everything is constructed out of matter. Everything is therefore related by causal laws. The world is real, it is independent of the mind, but it is knowable. It has a structure that can be discovered by the mind. And so far, this doesn't sound surprising. Lots of people in lots of Western countries, regardless of ideology, are materialists in something like this way. But then he says, the basic laws that govern that material world are the laws of dialectic. And here he does diverge. Most people would say the laws of physics or the laws of some other science. Here he says Marxist dialectic. Now, what are the basic principles of Marxist dialectic? This is how Stalin presents them. It's not exactly, in fact, not even remotely, I think, the way Marx would have presented them. But here's the idea. Everything is interconnected. So everything connects to everything else. That's part of the reason that everything is political. There is no sphere you can say, this is just private life, this is private taste, it has nothing to do with the revolution, it has nothing to do with social justice, etc. No, everything is interconnected, so everything is ultimately political. Secondly, everything is in a state of movement. The world is in constant flux. Nothing is static. There are no things that are really unchanging. Everything is changing, everything is moving all the time. But third, quantitative changes produce qualitative changes. In other words, we take things that are differences in quantity and they add up to differences in quality. Why does that matter? Because it means that in the end, reality is measurable. It's something that ought to be not only capable of scientific study, but capable of mathematical characterization. And everything that at first glance doesn't seem mathematical is really the result of these basic mathematical operations. So for example, temperature. Temperature is something we can measure. There is a qualitative difference between something that's hot and something that's cold, but in the end that's based on quantitative changes in temperature, for example, and those are in turn based on quantitative changes concerning the motion of molecules. And so that would be a simple example of the kind of thing Stalin has in mind. That's a case where it clearly applies and applies correctly. The controversial part of the claim is that's true of all qualitative changes. All qualitative things are really the result of these underlying quantitative things that have to do with the interconnections and movements of those material parts. And finally, the unity and struggle of opposites. Everything contains contradictions. That's the part that doesn't sound like an aspect of ordinary scientific realism, but is very different. The world is driven by conflict. Everything contains contradictions, and what he means by that is that everything contains these conflicting forces. Remember in Freud, we talked about the various drives, including the death wish, and the fact that it builds a kind of contradictory clashing force model into Freudian theory. Well, Stalin sees that as essential to Marxism. Marx talks a lot about the contradictions of capitalism, about the contradictions contained in this idea or that institution or that historical movement. And Stalin says everything is like it. Everything is really not just a history of class struggle, a history of struggle of opposites. And so there is always that kind of conflict of forces contained within everything. Now at first glance you might think, well, that's all very interesting, but I don't see what that has to do with like government or, actually making decisions about the world. But Stalin began at this point to make radical decisions that affected millions of people's lives. So how he got from that ideology of the short course to any of this remains something of a mystery. It's not something he discussed much in speeches or wrote about very much. But the first major effort was collectivization. Stalin looked around at a country that, especially after the new economic program, had a lot of small farms, a lot of peasants on small plots of land cultivating their farms. And Stalin had this idea that in order to advance, Russia had to industrialize, and it had to adopt an industrial model for agriculture as well. So, there were two problems. One is, how do you get the country to grow more food? Secondly, how do you get food from the countryside to these new industrial towns and cities that were being constructed as part of a forced industrialization of Russia? There was the problem of growing the food in the first place and then getting it to the towns. Well, this all came to a head in 1927, when there was a poor harvest due to bad weather. The peasants would no longer accept paper money for their crops. It was not quite the level of hyperinflation that existed in Germany in the 1920s, but nevertheless it was severe. And so the peasants said, look, this food, it's really valuable. It'll be valuable tomorrow. This paper money you want to give me for it, I don't know if it'll be of any value at all tomorrow. I won't take money for my crops. People began to hoard food, both on the farms and in the towns, and so food quickly disappeared from the marketplace. The government had trouble getting food to the towns. And so what did Stalin do? He sent 30,000 armed party workers into the fields to steal the peasants' food. Here you see some pictures of people headed into the fields to take food by force. Here you see a bunch of watchtowers, well, one watchtower. People were set up on the watchtowers to watch the peasants to make sure that the food that was being grown was being collected. Here you see people finding an underground storehouse of grain. Somebody had tried to hide some of the grain they were growing for their own use, and they got caught. This is actually target practice, but I couldn't find a picture of people actually being shot for hoarding the food, which is what happened. So in this case, no actual Russians were harmed, but plenty were in reality. Now in 1928, the result of this is that the farmers, having had their food stolen and being furious about it, planted even less. Once again, there was bad weather, the harvest was even worse. And so, desperate for cash, Russia began selling off anything they could sell. In particular, the Russian government began selling off art treasures. Andrew Mellon was smart enough to realize that this was a tremendous opportunity. He, with his fortune, managed to buy up many of these art treasures, and he created the National Gallery of Art, which is there as part of the Smithsonian now, that complex on the Mall in Washington, D.C., as a way of showing that private philanthropy could outperform government. It's ironic now because since he called it the National Gallery of Art, a lot of people think it's actually a government institution. But it isn't. It was a private institution set up by Mellon. And a lot of the art in there, in the initial collections at any rate, was gotten from the Russian government around this time, including a lot of the works that it contains of modernist painters. Well, in 1929, given the disaster that had occurred in the harvest of 1927 and 1928, Stalin decided the solution to this problem was simply to industrialize the countryside, to create large collective farms. Now, he did this impulsively, without really any discussion among any committee. He did it against the words of Lenin, who in 1921 had gone in exactly the opposite direction. He was basically undoing what Lenin had done in 1921, and going, in fact, much farther. He forced 105 million peasants into collective farms. To give you some perspective, that was 3/4 of the Russian population. They were forced to move from where they were, and they were put forcibly into these collective farms. It was, well, here's the way he described it. This is an all-out offensive against the kulak. What is a kulak? It was a farmer, basically a small farmer, somebody who did have enough to own their own plot of land, but it was usually a very small plot of land. We must smash the kulaks, eliminate them as a class, liquidate the kulaks as a class. Kalinowski, a historian of Marxism, described it this way. It was probably the most massive warlike operation ever conducted by a state against its own citizens. It was a question of forcing people off the farms, forcing them to move to these new large collective farms. The result was a disaster. More than 10 million people were slaughtered, were killed because they refused to leave their farms. Another 10 million were transported to Siberia, where they were asked to start large new farms, typically without tools, often in wintertime, in an area where temperatures get well below zero. 10 million, because they refused to cooperate, were placed in concentration camps. And the rest, those who conformed to this and actually agreed to be collectivized, lost all their property and were in effect enslaved in what Stalin himself referred to as grain factories, in the attempt to apply the industrial model to agriculture out in the countryside. The result of this was a man-made famine. More than half of all farm animals were slaughtered. Millions died as a result. Now, this first stage took place in 1929, and over the next year or so. It was a disaster, as you can see, for the Russian people. 10 million died immediately. Many of the 10 million who went to concentration camps subsequently died. It produced famine. Here you see photographs of the results of collectivization, the child with a swollen belly as a result of starvation. Here, there were relatively few newspapers in the West that reported any of this. Here was one of the few, the Chicago American. 6 million perished in Soviet famine. Peasants' crops seized, they and their animals starved. You see there in the upper right-hand corner a photograph of a starving horse. You see dead bodies being collected in wheelbarrows in some cases. Here's an eyewitness account. Barefooted and poorly clad peasants were jammed into railroad cars and transported to the regions of Murmansk and the like. Peasants were unloaded into snow about 2 meters deep. 2 meters, remember, that's 6 feet. Okay? The frost stood at 75 degrees below zero. Without even an axe or a saw, we began building huts from tree branches. In 2 weeks, all the children, the sick and the elderly, had frozen. Also in 1929, as these disasters were unfolding, Stalin needed someone to blame. After all, by now you can imagine that people were grumbling a lot about Stalin's leadership. This is not exactly a popular political program. 3/4 of the Russian population were forcibly moved, many of them killed. So, in 1929, he charged a group of mining engineers with sabotage in what became known as the first of the show trials. A 12-year-old son testified against his own father and demanded his execution. It was all very carefully scripted and orchestrated. Stalin gave speech after speech in which he denounced the Stockites, the wreckers, the hoarders, those who were destroying the economic program. Arrest, try, shoot was his motto. And here you see scenes from the show trials. There you see Marx and Engels and Lenin and then Stalin as the great Marxist heroes presiding in the background over these trials. In 1931 to 33, Stalin demanded of the Ukraine, the region in the Soviet Union that was the greatest grain-growing region, large quantities of grain. He insisted that to deal with these problems of famine, in part due to the poor harvest, but in large part, by this point, due to collectivization, he insisted that the Ukrainian farmers send more and more of their grain from the Ukraine to the Soviet Union. He refused to release any of the grain that they turned over back for use within the Ukraine. The result of that was an intentional starvation of the Ukraine and a massive famine. It's known as the Holodomor. It killed vast numbers of Ukrainians, somewhere between 5 to 40 million men. It was not a natural disaster. It was not the result of bad weather. It was not the result of some sort of confusion or mistake. It was an intentional program to starve out the Ukrainian people. And the result was something that actually was almost certainly larger than the Holocaust. Here you see people at gunpoint forcing the peasants to turn over their grain. Here you see a Ukrainian girl. And look at how thin she is, starving to death with a starving animal in the background. A starving horse. Again, a few Western papers presented this information: deliberate starvation of peasants, villages depopulated by hunger in Ukraine as Soviets punished their opponents. And that's exactly what was going on. But it did get relatively little press coverage in the West. Here you see children who have starved to death as a result of the Holocaust. Stalin, at a certain point throughout all of this, observed what Hitler was doing in Germany and realized that he could pursue some of his ends much more directly. He had been maneuvering throughout the 20s to get rid of his main competitors, but then he observed Hitler, in particular in something we'll talk about next time, the Night of the Long Knives, where Hitler simply had 5,000 to 7,000 of his main competitors knifed, murdered in one night. Stalin said, here I've been playing all these mean girls tricks, trying to outsmart people, trying to outmaneuver them. I could have just killed them. And so in 1934, Stalin, that was the year of the Long Knives, of the Night of the Long Knives, by the way, Stalin had more than 500 or more than 5,000 opponents of his murdered. That included Kirov, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, some of his main competitors from the early days. In 1935, he began secret negotiations with Hitler. In 1936, he began returning to the show trials. So Zinoviev, Kamenev, and 14 others were tried in 1936. Radek, the original head of the secret police, and 16 others in 1937. Then 21, including Bukharin and Rykov and Yagoda, in 1938. In all of these cases, confessions, often to outrageous things, were extracted under torture. Krasinski recanted on the first day of the trial and then reinstated his forced testimony and his confession on the second day with a dislocated shoulder, having been tortured overnight into doing that. Almost all of them ended up being executed. A few were sent to prison camps where they soon died. Now, what on earth was going on? This is Kalinowski writing about this period in Soviet history. During the 1930s, many of the people in the leadership, and as we'll see, it went from this initial group who were close to Stalin during the revolution to then a much, much wider group of people. But what on earth was going on, and why did people acquiesce to it? We had one person here who was sending 10 million people to their deaths through collectivization, then starving out between 5 and 40 million Ukrainians, then killing a lot of people within the party, staging these show trials. Why did people put up with it? Why didn't anybody overthrow him? Why didn't people fight back? Here's what Kalinowski says about this. After all the resistance had been overcome, all forms of social life not ordained by the state had been crushed out of existence. The opposition within the party destroyed. It was time to subdue the last element that might threaten the completeness of totalitarian rule under a single despot, namely the party itself, the instrument that had been used to stifle and destroy every other element of society. The destruction of the party was achieved during 1935 to 39. It established a new record of savagery. The Dewey Commission was set up in the West to investigate these show trials. People were shocked by the allegations, shocked by all of these communist leaders suddenly saying, I've been a counter-revolutionary, I've in fact been doing all these things behind the scenes to subvert the interests of the party. And so John Dewey and a group of people who were very prominent intellectuals in the West began to investigate the charges. The result was a book of theirs called Not Guilty. They concluded that there was no attempt at all made to ascertain the truth in these trials, that the confessions were not only forced, but contradicted available facts, and were not plausible even at all, and Trotsky never in particular plotted anything that he was accused of. So in short, it was all a sham. But it only began with the leaders who were actually publicly shamed in the show trials. There were 1,500 artists and writers who were murdered. 27 astronomers. Stalin decided that sunspots were contrary to Marxist theory. So anybody who had ever published anything in which they had advocated the existence of sunspots was executed. Many meteorologists were killed because they made inaccurate weather predictions. Imagine that. All right, KXAN, what's the weather going to be like tomorrow? Click. Ex-kulaks, anti-Soviet elements, people vaguely described, were executed. The number came close to 400,000 people, plus over 100,000 Poles, who were by then included in the Soviet sphere of influence. According to the Soviet archives, which were eventually released after the fall of the USSR, more than 1.5 million people were imprisoned during this era. 700,000 roughly were shot. That's an average of 1,000 people a day in 1937 to 1938. Now, a lot of historians think that's actually an understatement. Those were the ones they officially admitted to. The estimates go up to as many as 2 million people. And that's in part confirmed by these killing fields that have been unearthed in various places in the Ukraine that contain 200,000 bodies. People have begun the project of trying to document the victims. This period was known as the Great Purge or the Great Terror. André Gide, a French intellectual, described it this way. In my opinion, no country today, he's speaking in 1936, not even in Hitler's Germany, is the spirit more suppressed, more timid, more servile than in the Soviet Union. In 1937, Stalin killed 3,000 senior police officers, 90% of all prosecutors throughout the country, 30,000 army officers, 80% of the colonels and generals, over 1 million party members, maybe as much as 10% of the population. Why? They knew something of the history of the revolution. He wanted to make sure that no one could challenge his interpretation of Marxism and what it meant at any particular moment. So anyone who knew anything about the revolution, who had been there in 1917, who could have said, wait a minute, Lenin would not have approved, was executed. And that ended up committing him to killing a very large number of people. Later, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, the army was in terrible shape and barely survived. Why was it in such terrible shape? Because almost all the officers had been murdered just a few years before. Nobody knew what they were doing by 1940 or 1941 because essentially everyone in a leadership position was gone. More than 1 million people a year were murdered. Here you see an example of that. Army officers who were simply stripped, pulled to line up to kneel, and were shot in the back of the head. Well, these purges did claim an astounding proportion of people in the army. Not just a large number of people overall, but look at this, 3 out of 5 field marshals. 13 out of 15 commanders, 8 out of 9 admirals, 50 out of 57 Army Corps commanders, and so on, all the way down the line. So something like 90% of the officer corps was simply murdered. Well, this included 98 of the 139 members elected to the Central Committee in 1934. Within 3 years, most of them had been executed. Stalin also created a system of prison camps that became known as the Gulag. By the end of the 1940s, between 5.5 and 6.5 million people were held in the Gulag in this series of prison camps. There might have been as many as 15 million at the highest point of this. More than 1.5 million died. The red dots on that map indicate the locations of these prison camps. Throughout Siberia, in fact, it became a famous thing, it was sent to Siberia. But notice not only in Siberia, though most of these are in very unpleasant locations, most of them in locations where the prisoners could be forced to work, mining, or doing other nasty tasks. This is one of the most notorious of the camps, Kolyma. In one of my logic books, actually, in the first paragraph, I mentioned Kolyma among the disasters of the 20th century. And a bunch of people contacted me saying, I've never heard of this. What is Kolyma? Well, it was the worst of the Gulag camps. And here you see a photograph. It was a mining camp. People were sent there and forced to mine for gold and conduct other mining operations in horrendously unsafe conditions, often with temperatures far below zero. They were given a coat, minimal food, barely enough food to enable them to keep working. Often they ended up in the snow, in the permafrost, in conditions. The average high temperature in this region during the winter is 20 degrees centigrade below zero. And people often had no shoes, no boots. They would wrap newspapers around their feet. They were constantly suffering from frostbite. And as you can tell, the survival rate was not very high. Now, the Great Terror is something that struck terror throughout large portions of society, partly because it seemed so random. Who was being arrested? Who was being tried? Who was being shot? Anna Akhmatova, a famous poet, described it this way. I've seen faces consumed, glimpsed horror under lowered eyelids, cheeks etched by pain. Her own husband had been murdered in 1921 under Lenin's rule, but she began to see many, many other people meet the same fate. She herself was prohibited from publishing, and her response to the Great Terror was a poem, Requiem. One day, she wrote, somebody in the crowd identified me. Standing behind me was a woman with lips blue from cold, who had of course never heard me called by name before. Now she started on the torpor common to us all and asked me in a whisper. Everyone whispered there, can you describe this? And I said, I can. Then something like a smile passed fleetingly over what once had been her face. And here is part of the poem. 17 months I pleaded for you to come home. Flung myself at the hangman's feet. My terror, oh my son. And I can't understand. Now all is eternal confusion. Who's beast and who's man? How long till execution? If a gag should blind my tortured mouth, through which 100 million people shout, then let them pray for me as I pray for them. A brigade commander put it this way, I'm afraid to open my mouth. Whatever you say, if you say the wrong thing, you're an enemy of the people. Cowardice has become the norm. Stalin increasingly rewrote history. Here you see a photograph on the left, the original photograph, and then you see it on the right. That person who was there beside Lenin, he was not actually there are two there, I think. Stalin was not a fan of theirs. He didn't want the picture with Lenin, so the photograph was retouched. They're gone. Now actually, I'm sorry. This thing is in bad shape. The last time I was at the Smithsonian, actually, there was an exhibition of these photographs of the original photograph, and then often in stages, this person airbrushed out. It's like, at first there are 4, then there are 3, then there are 2, then there's just Stalin, okay, and things like that. Then there's just Lenin. Now, I want to talk about one particular case, because when you think about the death of millions in this way, it can become a statistic. Here I want to think about one particular person, Mikhailo Dray-Khmara. Dray-Khmara was a Ukrainian poet. He ended up being sent to Kolyma. he ended up writing a series of letters back to his family called Letters from the Gulag. He ended up dying there in Kolyma, partly from exposure, partly from illness, partly from the fact that his feet just split wide open as a result of going out and working in the permafrost with nothing but newspapers as shoes. In any event, he was seized in the middle of the night. It was well known at this time. The knock would come somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning. People would be seized and taken away and never seen again. What was his crime? He was a neoclassical poet. He wrote poetry in a classical style, and in particular, wrote a poem called White Swans in Ukrainian. And you can actually go to the link and see his NKVD file. There was the book consisting of his letters. And that's a photograph. Here are his last words in the last letter he wrote. Write me about your mother, because for a long time I've had no news from her. She's probably very lonely on the steppes. Tell me all about the family in Kiev, because I miss them. Be well. I wish everything good for you. Study. Be severe with yourself, because you're an orphan. Your fate is in your own hands. The daughter to whom he wrote that ended up becoming a professor at Columbia. And her son is my best friend, which is part of the reason I talk about his particular case. But it's something that dramatizes how someone who is a professor of poetry, someone who writes poems, okay, in the Ukrainian language, his native language, partly that was why he got into trouble. It was poetry in Ukrainian. He was supposed to be writing in Russian. Partly it was because this was neoclassical poetry based on novels of Virgil and various Roman and Greek poets. It was not expressing truths of the socialist revolution. But then partly perhaps because of the imagery of this particular poem. On the quiet lake where willows faint, the swans splash and paddle, floating in silence, crossing the waters in summer and autumn, their necks bent like lush vines. When the frosts come, resounding like plate glass, and the river glazes over, diving into crystal dreams, the swimmers shatter the sheets of ice, suddenly, fearlessly, the threat of winter. O fivefold cluster of unconquerable singers, through snow and thunder you chant your victory that breaks the ice of despair and unbelief. Be bold, swans, from bondage, from obscurity. A sparkling constellation leads you to a world where foams a whirling ocean of life. Now tell me about that poem. Suppose you just read that poem in your English course. Don't pick on my translation, by the way. You'd probably say, yeah, this translator did a sucky job. That's because my knowledge of Ukrainian is pretty primitive. Yes?
It's inspiring courage in a hard regime.
Ooh, yes. Okay, yes. Suppose you read this as a Soviet censor. Okay? Now, I would read it and think this is all about the seasons, right? It's about the hope of spring. And wintertime not being a terror. I mean, look, the swans are beautiful. Notice they break through the ice. They dive into crystal dreams. They do all of this stuff, shattering the sheets of ice. They're not afraid. They chant their victory. They're going to get to this place where life is foaming and so. But now, read it as a Soviet censor. On the quiet lake, where willows faint, the swans plash, paddle floating in silence. You're saying you feel silence coming? Crossing the waters in summer and autumn, the next bent like lush rain. When the frost comes, frost is, I notice these are white swans. White, as in the white Russian? Those who opposed us in the revolution? Are you championing the cause of those who are our enemies, comrade? And now, what happens? It is winter for them, and yet they are not afraid. They are not afraid. They crash through the ice. They break this. They are not fearing the threat of winter. Are you saying that Stalin's Russia is like winter come? They are unconquerable? Are you saying the revolution is doomed to fail? And now they are going to chant their victory? Break the ice of despair? You are saying that the Soviet Union is a country of despair? Why is my Russian now speaking in a British accent? I don't know. I'm doing very badly. Anyway, be bold. You're urging them to be bold. You're giving encouragement to the white Russians who oppose the communist revolution. This is an outrage. And the result of this will be a swirling ocean of life. You're saying life is not with the revolution, not with Comrade Stalin, but instead with those who oppose it? Off to the Gulag with you. Now, in fact, Dray-Khmara was a member of the Communist Party. He did not intend this as a counter-revolutionary document. He was writing about birds in the river in a style that was meant to remind you of some of the Greek poets of nature, that was meant to remind you of Tabalis in Latin poetry. It didn't matter. He was sent to the Gulag anyway. Now, here is how Kalinowski describes all of this. The concentration camps were full to bursting. Every Soviet citizen had got used to the fact that being arrested and sentenced to death, or to an arbitrary and indefinite term of imprisonment, had nothing to do with whether a man's work was good or bad, whether he did or did not belong to any kind of opposition, or even whether he did or did not love Stalin. The climate of atrocity brought about a kind of universal paranoia, a monstrous but unreal world in which all previous criteria, even those of ordinary despotism, had ceased to be applicable. An example of this, we'll read later, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was sent to the Gulag and spent a number of years there. What was his crime? In a letter back home during the war, he described Stalin as the man with the mustache. Okay? That was enough to get him sent to Gulag. Well, there was no credible threat here. That's the thing. It's not as if anybody was actually organizing opposition to Stalin. None of these people, these potential competitors, were in any way a threat to him. It weakened the state, it weakened the army, it weakened the sciences. When you've got your astronomers, your meteorologists, all these other people being murdered, it hardly does good things for your country. Why did no one resist? Why go after millions of underlings? Not just the main leaders, but millions of other people. Why did Western intellectuals, in particular, defend all of this? Well, some of those questions are answered by Kalinowski. He says the object of a totalitarian system is to destroy all forms of communal life, not imposed by the state and closely controlled by it. The goal is to isolate individuals. They're to become mere instruments in the hands of the state. The citizen belongs to the state and must have no other loyalty, not even to the state ideology. This may seem paradoxical, but it's not surprising to anyone who knows a system of this type from within. All forms of revolt against the ruling party, all deviations and revisionism, factions, cliques, rebellions, all alike had appealed to the ideology of which the party was the custodian. Consequently, that ideology had to be revised to make it clear to all that they were not entitled to appeal to it independently. Just as in the Middle Ages, unauthorized persons were not allowed to comment on the scriptures, and the Bible itself was at all times liber paracorum. Keep in mind that original people who were translating the Bible from Hebrew or Greek or Latin into vernacular languages like England ended up being burned at the stake. And it's something like that here. The party was essentially an ideological body. The members were linked by a common faith and shared values. But, as always happens when ideologies are turned into institutions, the faith had to be vague and indefinite enough to be used to justify any political move, while maintaining there was no real change of doctrine. What that meant is that there was no idea, no ideology, no body, nothing to which anyone could appeal. And indeed, when the guns turned on any individual who had been involved in this, why didn't they fight back? In fact, the most common reaction was, why? And if only Stalin knew, even though Stalin signed almost all of these death warrants individually. Stalin did know. Stalin ordered it all. Why didn't people fight back? Well, they hadn't objected to the fake trials and executions as long as the sufferers weren't party members. All of them accepted actively or passively that in principle there was nothing wrong with judicial murder. They just had agreed that the party leaders could decide who was a class enemy, a friend of the kulaks or an imperialist agent. They had accepted the rules of the game. Then they were brought to bear against them. They had no moral principles they could use to form a spirit of resistance. So, the Polish poet Alexander Watt encountered an old Bolshevik, Stetlov, and asked him why all the protagonists at the Moscow trials had confessed to the most ludicrous charges. He replied simply, "We were all of us up to our elbows in blood." Well, it is shocking, looking back, that a lot of Western intellectuals followed the developments in Stalin's Russia closely enough to know all of this. And they defended these tactics. Lincoln Steffens, George Bernard Shaw, André Malraux, Bertolt Brecht, Jean-Paul Sartre, Harold Denny, and Walter Duranty of the New York Times. Duranty won a Pulitzer Prize in 1932 for his reporting on Russia. Their writings were often used to break down the prisoners of the secret police in Russia. See, these Western intellectuals say what we're doing is the right thing to do. Durante himself, when reporting on this, talked about reports of corpses. He said, it's all bunk. Conditions are bad, but there's no famine. But to put it brutally, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. Orwell's response is, yeah, well, you've had decades now, where's the omelet? But a better response, I think, would have been to say, no, human beings aren't like eggs. Look magazine here with a glowing interview of Stalin. Bertolt Brecht, confronted with these stories of innocent people murdered, said the more innocent they are, the more they deserve to die. Lionel Trilling, himself a liberal, by the way, who viewed himself on the left, said, in any view of the American cultural situation, the importance of the radical movement of the 30s cannot be overestimated. It may be said to have created the American intellectual class as we now know it, with its great size and influence. It fixed the character of this class as being, through all mutations of opinion, predominantly of the left. And here you see a little image of that. An old lady reading Social Justice, World Revolution written by Stalin. Well, that's kind of a joke. But the effect of this was no joke. People said false thing after false thing about Soviet Russia. Very few actually wrote about it in anything like honest terms. Some of it was credulity. They visited and were shown a bunch of Potemkin villages. But sometimes it was mendacity, the heroic lie. Malcolm Muggeridge was one of the few journalists to actually report what he saw. And he was one who wrote, the novelty of this particular famine, what made it so diabolical, is that it wasn't the result of some catastrophe like a drought or an epidemic. It was the deliberate creation of a bureaucratic mind, demanding the collectivization of agriculture immediately as a purely theoretical proposition, without any consideration whatever of the consequences in human suffering. The interviewer says, you published Winter in Moscow when you got back from the Soviet Union. You were attacked for your views, very strongly. I couldn't get a job. Why was that? Because people found the reports hard to believe? No, the press was not overtly pro-Soviet, but it was, as now, essentially sympathetic with that side, distrustful of any serious attack on it. How do you explain this? He says, it's something I've written about and thought about a great deal. I think the liberal mind is attracted to this sort of regime. My wife's aunt was Beatrice Webb. She and Sidney Webb wrote the classic pro-Soviet book, Soviet Communism, A New Civilization. These were, with Shaw, by the way, part of the co-founders of the Fabian Society. And someone saw close at hand the degree to which they all knew about the regime, knew about the Cheka, the secret police, and everything. But they liked it. This will become one of the great puzzles of posterity, looking back on this age, to understand why the liberal mind, the Manchester Guardian mind, the New Republic mind, should feel such enormous sympathy with this authoritarian regime. You're saying they liked it? Yes. I remember Mrs. Webb, an upper-class, liberal-minded person, saying to me, yes, it's true. People disappear in Russia. She said it with such great satisfaction. I couldn't help thinking there were a lot of people in England whose disappearance she would have liked to help organize.